you going through life blind? This is Eyes Wide Open with Nick Thompson. On this podcast, we share knowledge and stories that build human connection while elevating stigmatized societal issues such as mental health, holistic wellness, culture, free speech, and more. All to ensure we show up in the world with our eyes wide open. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special 4th of July week episode of Eyes Wide Open. Today, I prepared my first solo episode, this is my first time doing a solo episode, so we'll see how it goes. But it's going to be a little bit shorter, and it's going to be focused on a topic that has become very important to me over the years and is now my number one political concern, and that is censorship, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, and the prosecution and recent release of journalist and founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. If you have followed me from my time on Love is Blind or have found this show through maybe another channel, I mentioned at the beginning of the show in the intro that the purpose of this show is to talk about stigmatized societal issues such as mental health, holistic wellness, free speech, and more. And throughout the filming of the show, I actually wore an Action for Assange bracelet because the importance of this topic and the activism and calling for the release of Julian Assange was a staple for me in my discourse. In fact, I actually attempted to wear a free press, free speech, free Assange t-shirt while filming After the Altar, and production informed me that I would not be able to film wearing that shirt. And what was their reason? That it was too controversial and Netflix might not be comfortable with that message on their streaming network. So I felt pretty dejected and I would say uneasy about the whole thing. But I decided to stop arguing my case and holding up the rest of the cast members and production for that matter and just change my shirt. But this highlights the level of issue with censorship and how real it is and how it's everywhere. But once I got back home, I immediately made an Instagram post, which is, using the platform that I have. And in that caption I had, "Shout it from the rooftops. A free press is the foundation of our country and a functioning democracy. We cannot jail Julian Assange or anyone for reporting facts. Censorship is happening at an alarming rate, and we need to protect free speech at all costs. If you don't agree with someone, use your speech to make a counterpoint and win with your idea." That was my caption. And then I was wearing the shirt that they wouldn't allow me to wear during production. But the issue of free speech and censorship has always been a core issue for me back to my time as a journalist in high school and in college, where I had my own interactions with censorship and even at some points found myself doing self-censorship, which is when you choose to censor yourself for some sort of fear of retaliation or follow-up, or in some cases, maybe like loss of job or loss of your role. And how fitting for the week that the United States is celebrating freedom with the 4th of July, that our very freedom of speech and the freedom of the press is taking such a devastating blow with the release of Julian Assange. And I want to break that down today. So let me take the next few minutes with you to break down what happened, why this matters to me, why you should care, and what the precedence is that this has set for future journalists, news and podcast hosts, or even really anyone that wants to speak or report on the government, state entities, corporations, or anyone in the future. Now, as you know, I myself have been speaking out against production companies in reality TV, streaming services in reality TV, demanding better treatment for cast members, better pay, better working conditions, all of these things. And I have once again myself found censorship to be a part of my everyday life. My content doesn't go as far. Once I started talking about these issues and whistleblowing on the mistreatment of cast members and mistreatment of myself and starting the UCAN Foundation, I've been censored. I have such limited reach on my social media, my YouTube channel, my podcast. They experience significant amounts of time without any growth or views or anything like that. And I believe that it's possible because this is not popular opinion among pretty powerful people in social media and the entertainment space. So I can't obviously prove that, but I do feel like I too have experienced censorship, as I've had a completely different experience on social media and even in interviews in some cases, on my own podcast and my own show, other shows that I go on, ever since I started speaking out about the mistreatment and exploitation in reality TV. But that being said, censorship, freedom of speech, elevating voices, having healthy debate are very core values. And that's why I want to start breaking down really why this Julian Assange case is so important for press freedom, but also just freedom of speech. So let's start by breaking down with the First Amendment, right? And if you speak to the First Amendment, we all know it's freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But what I actually did was went to whitehouse.gov and found how they describe from the government the First Amendment and how it's a cornerstone of our democracy. It provides that Congress can have no law respecting any type of establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise from citizens. It protects freedom of speech, the press, assembly and to protest, the right to petition the government and readdress any of our grievances with the people. And that should extend also onto corporations, right? Even as some of us would consider they're maybe merged a little bit. But the significance of the First Amendment cannot be overstated. So under the First Amendment, conducting journalism, questioning your government, or in the case of Assange, publishing war crimes the government didn't want the public to know about, should be constitutionally protected under the First Amendment. Now, maybe you're wondering a little bit, who is Julian Assange or what did he do? And I will say there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of perceptions that people have about why Julian Assange was actually in prison the last 5 years, or why he was initially being charged for what crimes he was initially being charged for, or even what happened. And that's okay, because it's a lot of information to sort through and there's a lot of commentary out there and it becomes difficult sometimes. I know I'm guilty of it too. It becomes difficult sometimes to separate fact from commentary, from opinion, especially in the way the media is presented to us. But Julian Assange is the head of WikiLeaks, and he really became a thorn in the side of powerful organizations and the governments in the world by using his platform to expose truths, publish acts of corruption, illegal activities, war crimes, etc. And in 2010, WikiLeaks released this bombshell of a video that shows a U.S. helicopter committing war crimes with a deadly attack on civilians in Baghdad. And there was also a Reuters photographer that was assaulted in this video of this war crime. And this was shocking to a lot of us. But what was even more shocking is there were also thousands of classified documents that were leaked by former U.S. soldier Chelsea Manning that were also made public. And these different records and these different public records suggested that the U.S. military had also been responsible for hundreds of unreported civilian deaths during the entirety of the Afghan war. So, as you can imagine, when a government and its army is committing war crimes, these leaks just sent all sorts of shockwaves around the world. And I remember when this happened too. It was pretty crazy. And these news outlets all over the place were covering this story, and it was really with scrutiny towards American involvement in these wars and these foreign conflicts. But unfortunately, that's not how the U.S. government saw it. In fact, they saw it very differently. They argued that these leaks endangered the lives of U.S. soldiers and personnel. Consequently, they then accused Julian Assange of conspiring to hack in and steal or obtain and receive all of these and then disclose, of course, all of these classified information, and claiming that that was illegal. And then he was charged with a real staggering 18 charges under the Espionage Act. Now, the Espionage Act is a U.S. law that was passed all the way back in 1917 from World War I to help protect national security by criminalizing spying or leaking what the government deems as classified information. But this was different because before Julian Assange had been charged under the Espionage Act, there was never, ever any type of journalistic act that was charged from the Espionage Act, because there had been a long, pretty much widespread assumption that applying the law to these types of journalistic acts would be unconstitutional based on what we talked about earlier with the First amendment. But here we are, and now we're here at this junction in American history where for the past 15 years, there's been a legal battle that forced Julian Assange to take drastic measures to avoid extradition to the US and has to face these charges as this whole saga has raged on for 15 years. And by the way, Julian Assange is not even a US citizen. So, how the federal government can charge him with a crime, I'm not exactly sure, but I digress because Assange was charged with these charges, and then he was forced to claim asylum in an Ecuadorian embassy in 2012 in London, where he spent 7 years in that building, not able to leave, not able to get air, not able to leave the hotel grounds, and ironically, it makes me think back to the handful of days when I wasn't allowed to leave my hotel room during filming of a show, and I started. I mean, I think anyone would start to go crazy. But 7 years unable to leave before a new Ecuadorian president basically forced him out, and he was consequently arrested by the UK police in 2019, and then has spent the last 5 years. Almost 5 years, fighting the legal attempts of the United States to extradite him here so we could charge him and sentence him for those crimes. Now, over the last few years, there's been many appeals from Julian Assange defense team. There's been horror stories from his family about his deteriorating mental health, his physical health, not being able to see his young children grow up. And last week, on Monday, June the 24th, 2024, they finally reached a plea deal where Assange agreed to plead guilty to one single felony account of illegally obtaining and disclosing national security material in exchange for being released on a sentence of, air quotes here, time served, that he's already been in prison. And that essentially sent him free to return to his Australian home with a few more formalities to come up in the days before that happened. But let's call this what this is. And for Assange to obtain his freedom, he had to plead guilty to an arguably illegal charge against him as a non-citizen with complete disregard for the First Amendment press freedoms. And the US government has somehow managed to still make an example out of Assange in a way that will lead journalists all over the world to leave certain types of important stories unreported because of the fear of what they did to Julian Assange being done to them. The fear of facing a similar retaliation or prosecution. So maybe, and I know I wondered this, like, why did he take this deal? But then it became pretty clear, in my view, and I've heard this from many of the activist groups that have been fighting for Assange, and maybe even some other political leaders have said this, but he really had no choice if he wanted to sort of gain any resemblance of a life. For years, family members have shared these deterioration details of his health, his mental wellness, all of these things that I mentioned. And without taking some sort of plea deal, he would likely have died in prison or deteriorated his health so badly that he would have no quality of life. And so I understand why he would take that plea deal after 15 years of being away from his family and under scrutiny from the US government for conducting the crime of journalism. So, what does this mean? Like, moving forward, I think it's a little bit scary. But before that, Julian Assange is free, and I am grateful. This is a cause, as I mentioned, that's been very important to me. I'm grateful he's free from a human to human standpoint. I'm grateful he can go home, and I'm hopeful that his freedom will help heal his mental health, his physical health, those relationships with his family, his friends, and his young children. I can't even imagine how exhausting all of this has been for his friends and his family and his children. But what I fear is that this has set a scary precedence for press freedom and a massive blow to freedom of speech, because at its core, Julian Assange conducted journalism that exposed war crimes and government corruption, and now he's been prosecuted for doing so. A journalist who isn't an American citizen has pleaded guilty to a federal crime of conspiracy to obtain disclosed national defense information and share it out. And this is all just to get out of prison and save his own life. This is essentially torture. And when you torture someone to the point where I feel like he's been tortured, you are making the lie, the plea, if you will, so much better to someone who has stood on press freedom for decades now at this point with WikiLeaks. Submit, tap out, give into the torture. And I am happy that in the end he got his freedom. I genuinely am. And still at the cost of spending years in isolation, away from his family and in prison, taking on financial debt. He had to charter a private flight to go back to Australia as part of this deal, which is costing, I think it was $520,000, which they have a GoFundMe for, which I will put down in the link to help cover those costs. So he's taking on financial debt, confessing to a crime that he did not commit. The outcome that the United States federal government has successfully conducted is that they've criminalized journalism, extended jurisdiction to non-citizens that are journalists, and the cost of Julian Assange's freedom goes beyond the lost time and props him up really as an example of what the government can do to you if you report the news they do not want the public to know. So next time a journalist or you or I have news or ideas that may go against the narrative or expose information that these entities or your specific entity do not want public or do not want people knowing, they'll have to think long and hard about how Julian Assange was treated, the price he's paid, and the example he has become of what happens if you challenge authority. This is, in my view, the greatest issue of our time. When you have a mainstream media where journalists can be silenced or not allowed to report certain stories based on advertising, based on the network, based on an oligarch who owns the network's point of view. And I think we've all seen examples of this, especially over the last few years, where we have seen all sorts of dissenting voices deplatformed, demonetized, censored, removed, narratives pushed. And then you have independent journalists who will naturally have to consider self-censorship as a way to protect their platform, which could very likely be tied to their income or perhaps even their freedom. Because if it's a breaking news story about government corruption or business corruption, and you see Julian Assange spend 15 years in prison, you might think a little bit differently before you, conduct that piece of reporting. Now, I'm very happy for Julian Assange, the human. I'm very concerned for Julian Assange, the example. And when I say by the example, I mean the example of what can happen to you if you expose government war crimes or if you expose other types of corruption. So make no mistake about this. The plea deal that Julian Assange has reached, prosecutors, is necessary for his health and wellness, but it is terribly bad for American press and our freedom of speech. So as we celebrate his release, let's remember that this is not about one man's freedom or one journalist's freedom. It's about defending the Constitution's fundamental principles of free speech, its citizens' public right to know what our government is doing. It is our responsibility as a society to ensure that we protect these rights. Now, I have spent a lot of time prepping this episode. I wanted to make sure I had my facts correct. I hope it helped kind of break down this very complicated topic into layman's terms to help you understand why I believe that this is important, why this is a crossroads at our time, and the importance of Assange's case and the precedents it set, so that it helps you go through life with your eyes wide open. Thank you for joining me on this special episode. Let me know what you think of my first solo episode. You can shoot me a DM, leave a comment, leave a review. If you enjoyed it, I could probably do more like this on varying topics. But I hope you have a great 4th of July. We'll be back next week with an all new episode. Take care. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Eyes Wide Open. If you enjoy the show, the best way to support us is by sharing or dropping a review. For more information and content, check out engagewithnick.com or find me on Instagram at nthompson513. Don't go through life blind. Do the work so you can show up in the world with your eyes wide open.